At 91 years old, I've learned that some of life's most painful lessons have nothing to do with money, health, or growing old. They have to do with people. For most of my life, I believed that friendship was something built through time. If someone had been in my life for 20 years, I trusted them. If someone had shared holidays, conversations, and memories with me, I called them a friend. It seemed simple, but after 9 decades of living, loving, losing, and watching people come and go, I've discovered something that still breaks my heart. Time does not create friendship. Proximity does not create friendship. History does not create friendship. And some of the people I trusted most were never truly my friends at all. That realization didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, one disappointment at a time, one unanswered phone call at a time, one moment of loneliness in a crowded room at a time. Looking back now, I can see the signs clearly. But when you're living inside a relationship, especially one that has lasted for years, the truth can be difficult to accept. Sometimes we hold on because we're loyal. Sometimes we hold on because we're hopeful. And sometimes, if we're honest, we hold on because we're afraid of being alone. I know I did. But everything changed when I finally realized that being surrounded by the wrong people can feel far lonelier than sitting in an empty room by yourself. Today, I want to share the 3 lessons that helped me recognize who my real friends were and who never truly deserved that title. And trust me, the 3rd lesson was the one that took me the longest to learn. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about wisdom, aging, and life's hard-earned lessons, subscribe to Longevity Harbor. Now let me tell you about the friendships that taught me the truth. My name is Magnolia Dorothea Sims, and at 91 years old, I've spent most of my life believing that loyalty was one of the greatest virtues a person could have. I was raised in a different time, a time when people stayed, a time when friendships lasted decades, or at least, that's what we like to believe. Back then, if someone had been part of your life for years, you didn't question their place in your heart. You showed up for them. You helped when they needed you. You forgave mistakes. And above all, you stayed loyal. That was the way I lived. I held on to friendships through marriages, divorces, illnesses, relocations, and funerals. I celebrated birthdays, attended baby showers, sat in hospital waiting rooms, and stood beside people during some of the hardest moments of their lives. I believed that was what friendship meant. And if I'm being honest, I was proud of it. I liked being the dependable one, the person people could call, the person who remembered anniversaries, sent cards, checked in after difficult surgeries, and never forgot a name or a story. It made me feel useful. It made me feel connected. Most importantly, it made me feel less alone, because beneath all that loyalty was a fear I rarely admitted, even to myself. I was afraid of losing people, afraid of becoming one of those elderly women who sat alone in quiet houses waiting for the phone to ring. So whenever a friendship became one-sided, I made excuses. Whenever someone disappointed me, I told myself they were busy. Whenever I felt overlooked, I convinced myself I was expecting too much. Year after year, I protected relationships that were no longer protecting me. And the saddest part is that I didn't realize I was doing it. Not until a series of painful experiences forced me to ask a question I had avoided for decades. Were these people truly my friends? Or was I simply holding on to the idea of friendship because I was afraid of what life might look like without them? That question would change everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. The first lesson took me the longest to recognize because it was hidden behind years of history. When someone has been part of your life for decades, it's easy to mistake familiarity for friendship. I certainly did. One of those people was a woman I'll call Dolores. We met when we were both young mothers, trying to balance families, responsibilities, and the endless demands of everyday life. Over the years, we became what everyone would have called close friends. We attended church together, shared meals together, celebrated birthdays together. When people saw us, they assumed we would be friends forever. And for a long time, I believed that too. Whenever Dolores needed help, I was there. When her husband became ill, I drove her to appointments. When she was overwhelmed, I listened for hours. When she was grieving, I sat beside her and offered whatever comfort I could. I never kept score. At least, I didn't think I did. Because that's what friendship is supposed to be. You give without calculating. You help without expecting payment. You show up because someone matters to you, and I genuinely cared about her. But life has a way of revealing truths we would rather not see. Several years later, my family went through a frightening situation. For 3 days, we were consumed by worry and uncertainty. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped. It was one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences of my life. During those 3 days, many people knew what was happening, including Dolores. She called once, one short phone call. She said she was praying for us. She said everything would probably be fine. And then she disappeared. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Everyone has their own life. Everyone gets busy. That was the excuse I always used. But deep down, something had changed. For the first time, I noticed a pattern. Whenever Dolores needed support, I rearranged my life. Whenever I needed support, she offered words. Never time, never presence, just words. A few years later, I had surgery. Nothing life-threatening, thank God, but enough to leave me scared and vulnerable. Once again, I found myself paying attention. And once again, the pattern repeated itself. A card arrived in the mail. A thoughtful message, kind words, but no visit. No phone call to ask how I was recovering. No genuine effort to be there. And suddenly, decades of friendship looked different. Not because Dolores was a bad person. She wasn't. But I finally understood something important. Some people love receiving your support more than they love supporting you. They value your generosity. They appreciate your reliability. They enjoy knowing you're there. But when the roles are reversed, they quietly step back. The hardest part is that these people often call you strong. I heard that word many times. Magnolia, you're strong. Magnolia, you'll be fine. Magnolia always figures things out. For years, I accepted those words as compliments. Now I hear them differently. Sometimes people call you strong because it frees them from the responsibility of helping. If they convince themselves you don't need support, they never have to offer it. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. After 91 years, I've learned that real friendship is not measured by how often someone needs you. It's measured by whether they show up when you need them. Because the people who truly care about you don't only appear during the easy seasons of life. They stay when life becomes difficult. And that was the moment I began to understand the difference between someone who loved what I could do for them and someone who genuinely cared about me. The second lesson was much harder to recognize because it didn't come from someone who was openly mean. There were no arguments, no shouting, no insults. In fact, if you met this woman, you would probably think she was pleasant. That was what made the friendship so confusing. I'll call her Celestine. For many years, she was one of the people I spent the most time with. We shared coffee, attended community events together, and spoke regularly. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal, but there was something I couldn't explain. Whenever I spent time with her, I felt a little worse afterward. Not devastated, not angry, just smaller. At first, I thought the problem was me. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I lacked confidence. Maybe I was imagining things. But over time, I began noticing a pattern. Whenever I shared an opinion, she had a better one. Whenever I talked about a decision, she suggested a smarter approach. Whenever I felt proud of something, she somehow found a way to make it seem less impressive. The strange part was that she rarely said anything openly critical. Everything came wrapped in politeness, a smile, a gentle suggestion, a thoughtful observation. That made it easy to dismiss. One afternoon, after Celestine left our house, my husband Hosea asked me a simple question. Have you noticed that you never seem happier after she visits? I laughed at first. Then I realized he was right. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt encouraged after spending time with her. That realization stayed with me. Over the following months, I started paying attention to how I felt before and after our conversations. The difference was impossible to ignore. Before meeting her, I felt relaxed. Afterward, I felt uncertain. Before seeing her, I trusted my judgment. Afterward, I questioned myself. The clearest moment came one morning when I was getting dressed to meet her for coffee. Standing in front of the mirror, I caught myself wondering whether she would approve of what I was wearing. And suddenly, I stopped. I was nearly 70 years old. Why was I dressing for another woman's approval? Why was I giving someone else's opinion so much power? That morning, I chose the outfit I liked, not the one I thought would impress her. When we met, she made one of her usual comments. Years earlier, I would have explained myself. Instead, I simply smiled and said, I like it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Looking back now, I don't believe Celestine was intentionally cruel. But I've learned that not everyone who damages your confidence does it loudly. Some people do it quietly. A comment here, a comparison there, a subtle reminder that they know better. Individually, those moments seem harmless. But over the years, they accumulate. They shape the way you see yourself. That's why one of the most important lessons I've learned is this. A real friend should not leave you feeling smaller than when you arrived. They should not make you second guess your worth. They should not require you to edit yourself in order to feel accepted. A real friend makes you feel comfortable being exactly who you are. And once I understood that, I began seeing some relationships far more clearly than ever before. The third lesson was the most painful because it took me the longest to understand. Maybe that's because I didn't want to believe it. After all, we expect people to disappoint us during difficult times. We know some people disappear when life becomes messy, but we don't expect the people closest to us to struggle with our happiness. And yet, some do. I learned this lesson through a woman I'll call Yvette. We had known each other for decades. We had attended family gatherings together, shared meals, exchanged Christmas cards, supported one another through different seasons of life. At least, that's what I thought. For many years, I considered her one of my closest friends. Then something happened that made me see our relationship differently. My granddaughter Shanice had been working toward a dream for years. She studied tirelessly, made sacrifices, overcame setbacks that would have discouraged many people. I watched her struggle. I watched her persevere. And one afternoon she called me with wonderful news. She had been accepted into a graduate program she desperately wanted. I was overjoyed. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. I felt proud in the way only a grandmother can feel proud. Naturally, I wanted to share the news, so I called Yvette. The moment she answered, I could barely contain my excitement. Shanice got in, I told her. There was a brief pause, just a few seconds. But at my age, I've learned that pauses often reveal more than words. Finally, Yvette replied. Oh, that's wonderful. Then she added, those programs are incredibly stressful. I hope she's ready for that kind of pressure. And just like that, something changed. The joy I had been feeling suddenly felt smaller. Instead of celebrating, I found myself worrying. Instead of feeling proud, I began thinking about everything that could go wrong. It wasn't a terrible comment. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it so difficult to recognize. The words sounded reasonable, even caring, but they accomplished something important. They shifted the focus away from the achievement and toward the fear. And once I started paying attention, I realized this wasn't the first time. It happened whenever good news entered the conversation. If something exciting happened, Yvette found a concern. If something hopeful happened, she found a warning. If something joyful happened, she found a problem. Never enough to seem negative, just enough to dim the light. For years, I ignored the pattern because I assumed she meant well. Maybe she did. But eventually I realized that intention matters less than impact. A friendship should not make you afraid to share your happiness. A friendship should not train you to expect criticism every time something good happens. The final realization came when I noticed that I had stopped telling Yvette things. Not because we argued, not because we fought, but because sharing good news no longer felt good. And that led me to ask a difficult question. If I couldn't share my joys, my hopes, or my victories with someone, what kind of friendship was I protecting? Real friends don't compete with your happiness. They don't search for shadows when you're standing in the light. They celebrate with you. They smile when you smile. They allow your joy to remain joyful. At 91, I've learned that one of the purest tests of friendship is simple. Who becomes genuinely happy when something good happens to you? The answer reveals more than years of conversation ever could. Because the people who truly love you don't feel threatened by your success. They feel grateful to witness it. And once I understood that, I finally began recognizing who my real friends were and who had only been passing through my life all along. For a while, after I began letting certain friendships fade, my life became much quieter. The phone rang less often. There were fewer invitations, fewer conversations, fewer familiar names appearing on birthday cards and holiday messages. And if I'm honest, that silence frightened me. At 91 years old, most people assume you've already learned how to be alone. But the truth is, loneliness doesn't care how old you are. It can find you at 19. It can find you at 91. There were mornings when I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and wondered whether I had made a mistake. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much from people. Maybe friendship simply wasn't what I thought it was. Those doubts stayed with me for months. Then something happened that changed everything. A young woman named Portia moved into the neighborhood. She couldn't have been more than 30 years old, young enough to be my granddaughter. At first, we were simply neighbors, nothing more. Then one afternoon, a few months after my husband Hosea passed away, she knocked on my door holding a container of homemade chicken and rice. She smiled and said, "I made extra and thought you might like some." Now, at my age, you learn to recognize kindness, not the kind people perform, the kind they quietly live. I invited her inside. We sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt heard. Portia didn't interrupt. She didn't compete. She didn't correct. She didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for. She simply listened. When I talked about Hosea, she listened. When I talked about my fears, she listened. When I showed her the watercolor paintings I had started making after turning 70, she smiled and said, "These are beautiful because they're yours, not because they were perfect, not because they were impressive, simply because they belong to me." And I cannot fully explain why those words touched me so deeply. Perhaps because so many people spend their lives judging, comparing, correcting, and evaluating. Very few simply accept. Over the next few years, Portia became one of the truest friends I have ever known. Not because she solved my problems, not because she constantly checked on me, but because her presence brought peace instead of pressure. That was when I finally understood something that had taken me nearly a century to learn. Being alone is not the same as being lonely. I had felt lonely in crowded rooms, lonely during conversations, lonely inside friendships that existed only out of habit. Yet sitting quietly in my kitchen with a genuine friend felt warmer than being surrounded by dozens of people who never truly saw me. At 91, I have fewer friends than I did at 50. Far fewer. But every one of them makes my life better simply by being part of it. And that, I've learned, is the difference between people who occupy space in your life and people who genuinely belong there. The older I get, the more I believe that real friendship is not about how many people know your name. It's about who stays when there is nothing to gain, nothing to prove, and nothing required except genuine care. Those are the people worth holding on to. Looking back over 91 years, I realize that friendship is not measured by time. It's measured by presence. For much of my life, I believed that if someone had been around for decades, they deserved a permanent place in my heart. But experience taught me otherwise. I learned that some people love what you can do for them, but disappear when you need them most. I learned that some people slowly chip away at your confidence while pretending to help. And I learned that some people cannot celebrate your happiness without finding a reason to dim it. Those lessons were painful, but they were also freeing, because once I stopped confusing history with friendship, I began seeing people more clearly. Today, I no longer ask how long someone has been in my life. I ask a different question. Do they make my life warmer, kinder, and more peaceful? If the answer is yes, I hold them close. If the answer is no, I let them go with compassion. After all these years, I've learned that a few genuine friends are worth more than 100 familiar faces. And that may be one of the most valuable lessons life has ever taught me. If there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, it's this. Not everyone who stays in your life deserves a permanent place in your heart. Real friendship isn't measured by years. It's measured by care, presence, and the way someone makes you feel when life becomes difficult. At 91, I have fewer friends than I once did. But the friendships I have now are real. They bring peace instead of pressure, warmth instead of doubt, and that is more than enough. If this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear from you. How many people do you believe are truly your friends today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about wisdom, aging, and life's hard-earned lessons, subscribe to Longevity Harbor. Because some of the most important truths in life take decades to understand.